Okay, so it's recording now. All right. Thank you to everyone who's attending, and thank you, of course, to the panelists who agreed to speak on Sara's exciting new book. And thank you to Sara for having written a fantastic new book for us to talk about. So in Intimate Geopolitics, Love, Territory, and the Future on India's Northern Threshold, Sara Smith asks how love and marriage are bound up with global and regional geopolitical processes that make territory. Focusing on Ladakh, a region located on India's northern frontier, the book asks how territory is made every day in marriage and birth ceremonies, in the kitchen, in the rearing of babies, and in everyday experiences of childhood, youth, and religious life. The book is based on research conducted for about a decade and a half in Ladakh. Sara Smith is an associate professor of geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's a feminist political geographer interested in the relationship between territories, bodies, and the everyday. So the commentators we have today are, in the order that they will be speaking, Akhtar Zia, an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Akhtar is a scholar of Kashmir and is writing a book about enforced disappearances, militarization, gender, and human rights abuses in the region. Akhtar is also a journalist, writer of nonfiction on Kashmir, and a poet. Catherine Brickell is Professor of Human Geography at Royal Holloway, University of London. Catherine's work forwards scholarship on critical geographies of home and gendered experiences of violence. Catherine's new monograph, Home SOS, Gender, Violence and Survival in Crisis Ordinary Cambodia, brings domestic violence and forced eviction into twin view to pursue this, and was published in July 2020 by the Wiley RGS IBG book series. Majid Akhtar is lecturer in Environment and Society at King's College London. Majid was born in Saudi Arabia and has lived and worked in Pakistan and the US. He is a scholar of infrastructures and technopolitics in Pakistan. He has written about militarization and drones, about the politics of water, and about sovereignty and state power. Okay, so I'm going to let Akhtar begin our session for us with some comments, followed by Catherine and then Majid. And then Sara will respond to those comments, and then we'll have questions from our audience. Thank you.
Unmuting myself. Okay. So thank you so much, Sneha, for inviting me to this panel. And before making any comments, I really want to say that it was an honor to read the book. I would not have, in this pandemic, I probably would not have organically been having this on my reading list. But I was really happy to be reading this, especially because as a scholar who's been working in Kashmir region, Ladakh is very predominant in our psyche, but at the same time, it doesn't feature in the same manner because we're so taken up with what's happening inside Kashmir Valley and how Ladakh features there, and we never kind of like look at it in and of itself. So in that sense, I mean, Mona Bhan's work, I've read very closely. We work very closely with each other. Ravina Agarwal's work, of course, and the other people that you mentioned. And so I've read all of those books, and but this kind of adds something that's very close to my heart, because you are talking about gender and you're talking about what I see as feminist anthropology. So at moments, I was also kind of like taken back to thinking about foundations of anthropology, thinking how it was like there's literally no difference between how geography and human geography looks at the world and how we look at the world. So just some preliminary comments. I do have some informally written comments that I want to read because I don't want to miss anything that I want to say. But I haven't really, I think I should take about 9 minutes to read this. And I'll just try to be as brief as possible and not digress. So, I'm just trying to get the panel as well as my writing here. So just give me a moment. So again, thank you so much for having me on the panel. So when I got hold of this book and began reading it, essentially what it did for me is that it started teaching me about how modern processes of democracy makes us primarily inhabit political bodies or make our bodies political, and essentially weapons that can be deployed in a war that masquerades as electoral politics. Being a Kashmir scholar, this is kind of like my vantage, and I know that I'm kind of taking a different aspect altogether as I begin. In Sara's beautiful rendition of the stories and her analysis, we see how people in the region of Ladakh, both Buddhists and Muslims, come to inhabit the political Buddhist body and the political Muslim body. This built upon centuries of living together and not without differences. This book offers a vivid insight into understanding how the post-colonial aftermath continues to bear upon the bodies of peoples who can only be counted as what has come to be known as minorities. Minority is not a fair word to anyone, it is derogatory, but here I use the term in terms of numbers. And to note that in that part of the world, this word is used without any qualms and also to define policy in the government parlance. By centralizing women's bodies as the perceived future of these remotely located communities, Sara asks, what does it mean to inhabit a geopolitical body, a body charged with geopolitical potential? How is marriage implicated in geopolitics? How do intimate and how does the knowledge of this process affect subjectivities of those who participate in it? She draws our attention to how geopolitics is intimate. I love the theorization of intimate geopolitics. We can go back into it later. And how the struggle for territory is so masculine, yet every time it's carved on and through the bodies of women. Because for lack of a better technology, women, even in the 21st century, still are the creators of species life. In the region of Jammu and Kashmir, I have, as Sara mentions this, and I think it's very important to note, I personally felt while Ladakh was not included in the nomenclature after 1947, which has invisibilized it, no doubt. When the so-called modern era of democracy dawned in this region in 1947, it parceled the land and people, marked territory, which was still contested, still restive. Representative democracy imposed a certain mode of governmentality. A Foucauldian biopower subjected life to extreme control and regulation, apparently for better in order to administer, optimize, and multiply life. Earlier, there were peoples, now who must be specifically identified, counted, categorized, no ounce of subjectivity left to chance, no aspect of identity left undescribed. Everything needs to be determined in order to be counted. People have to make an allegiance, and it's not just spiritual, religious, but it has to have a political color, and only then will their numbers survive, not just survive, but thrive. And I'm sorry if I seem too skeptical about the notion of democracy, because that's how it emerges in Kashmir, and we'll talk more about that. But as a Kashmiri, as a global citizen, I'm really yet to come to terms with the fact the way it's imposed and carved on the bodies of indigenous people everywhere. It is in this matrix Sara locates the political bodies of people of Ladakh, more specifically the women, who have to bear the burden of propagating the numbers. While it might look like that religion needs the numbers, but it's actually the representative democracy, the electoral politics that needs those numbers in order for the people to count. The issue of population problem, as described by the Buddhist research partners in the book, vis-a-vis radical Muslim fertility, is not a religious problem to me per se, but essentially a democracy problem which uses religion as a vehicle. It's fashioning of political subjectivities by utilizing religious identities that becomes the problem, where each child born now is not a spiritual being, but a new number, where the body becomes a weapon to gain and protect not just the territory, but also project a certain territoriality. One of the biggest reflections of this, as Sara illustrates, is the decline of intermarriages between the two communities. What earlier was not to glorify the era and gloss over indifferences, but to some extent some communal harmony that existed between the communities because they were tied by history, economically and culturally. But by the time democracy takes root, and democracy in quotes, and finally when BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, the Hindu supremacist political party fueled by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Hindutva ideology arrives, the practice of what is deeply human, falling in love, was cast in the politics of love jihad. This derogatory term implicates routine interreligious romantic relationships, specifically between Muslim men and women from different religions, especially Hindu, and in this case, Buddhist, as a covert war by Muslims to ensnare women to fight a demographic war by other means. Sara illustrates a level of syncretism. I don't know if you would use the word, but just for the lack of a better word and better projection here, that existed pre-1947 when intermarriages were common between Buddhists and Muslims. And this also reminded me of former Yugoslavia, where Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs would intermarry without issue. And then when the ethno-nationalism came to fore, and that kind of went away. So you kind of see the reflection here as well. It's fascinating to watch Sara cull from what to an untrained eye might see mundane daily lives of people, especially those of women, as they talk about decisions around family planning. Here I must mention that in the years between 1947 till 1989, even after that, family planning was largely perceived as a benign policy in Kashmir. As Sara also says, as a mechanism to alleviate poverty, also produce better citizen bodies for the new nation state. And again, nation state in quotes, especially from a Kashmiri vantage. Despite Islam and being accused of wanting to impose what is stereotypically demonized as Sharia state, which we also see the reflections in the book as the Buddhist research partners are talking to you, Kashmir has had one of the most successful family planning programs. It's called family planning. My mother is a doctor, and all her life, this was what she did. She retired as a statewide mass media officer who was responsible for taking family planning program to masses. Her job was to make sure less Muslim bodies were created. The slogan in entire India was that was prevalent also in Kashmir was Hum do hamare do, meaning we too and our too. And it was completely fine and still is, despite militancy, killings, and all the stereotyping of like Islamic militancy and Sharia states and all of that. Muslim Kashmiris are still sticking to having 2 or at the maximum 3 children. And it's quite evident in the book that this has been the case in the Ladakh too, to some extent in both communities, and especially Muslim communities, which is really fascinating. So when the demographic militancy of Muslim Ladakhis becomes a problem for Buddhists, that's the juncture that we kind of like want to think about. And for me, that's very productive because that is a very important moment. And it's kind of like the late 80s and early 90s when this starts to kind of change hue. So this is key in understanding not just the hegemony of Muslim Kashmiris overall, because that is so prevalent in the book, and that is me too, right, as a Muslim Kashmiri. But at the same time, also understanding this moment as the necropolitical Indian nation state. Because what's happening in this region is not democracy. And that's something that I'd really like to talk about as we take this forward. The politics that India imposed on Kashmir was the politics of handling Kashmir. So which is why you see the state of J&K and not state of Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh, is essentially the politics of creating and maintaining rifts. Here we see on page 38, 58, where you mentioned, I do want to kind of read quickly. And yet for Buddhists, shifting to the scale of J&K reveals a very different optic. And to me, it's so important because, you just have to sort of like kind of empathize with every vantage here. Every list of people selected for government posts, police positions, or other state-based positions is a list of almost entirely Muslim names, and the 1947 integration into India did little to alleviate the uneven power relationships. Ladakh escaped domination by a Hindu king, only to be ignored by the new Muslim majority government based in Srinagar and Jammu. The inclusion of Ladakh in the state of Jammu and Kashmir was a relic of colonial era that colored the daily life. So one is that I wouldn't without any question kind of accept the idea that this was integration, because that is still contested, but that's besides the point. I can totally understand why it's being used here, but at the same time, the reason I kind of read this is because we also have to understand this moment in the post-1947 Muslim vantage. Like you use the Ladakhi vantage, I kind of like deploy the Kashmiri Muslim vantage. The accession was disputed and contested, and there's political turmoil. People are awaiting the plebiscite in every decade, despite the fact that they are forced to vote in an illegal election that the Indian government still peddles as very, very licit. And over the years, what has happened in Kashmir, there's 2 clear-cut lines of politics that have begun to emerge. The politics of governance, which kind of falls in line with what Ladakh wants, and at the same time, politics of azadi, which mainly Buddhist Ladakhis don't see eye to eye with. And I also know that many Muslim Ladakhis as well. So at this time, what's happening is, and I'm not trying to kind of like give an explanation this as much as trying to understand for myself this particular moment. So at this moment, Kashmir is really handled by corrupt client politicians. I think for lack of a better term, and when I speak about these junctures in historical moments, I feel like not calling them politicians and client politicians really gets some message across, especially to many people who haven't read a lot about Kashmir, one after the other, and they are essentially catering to the voting constituencies, and real development is nowhere on the agenda. So Ladakh is not their problem. On the other hand, Kashmiri Muslims are also awakening after centuries of subjugation, which people in Ladakh too had witnessed in different manner. The project here of the post-1947 emergency administration, especially in the Indian-administered Kashmir, of which Ladakh is a part, and which was built on it, was to consolidate border for India and not focus on state making. Autonomy is a sham. I'm just describing the moment. And in this equation, Ladakh becomes invisible and yet very visible in Kashmir in an inverse way. And this was to me very, very interesting. When I read the mention of jobs going to all Muslim Kashmiris, I was reminded of mandatory postings that teachers, doctors, and bureaucrats had to do, that they had to go to Ladakh in order to kind of like even begin their jobs. So Kashmiri Muslims, they used to see Ladakh as a place where they would go and they would first vomit blood because of the altitude, where they would see the separation from their families for 6 months. So there was that dynamic as well. So did they really want to go, like if it was not handling, if it was real governance, would it have been something different? If it was not necropolitics masquerading as democracy, would it have been something else? Or how problematic is democracy when you impose it for other reasons? So, so this is all I have to say before we move on to questions later on. And I'd love to hear what you have to say, what you all have to contribute. But I did really like what you mentioned. I mean, I think that really took my breath away, that one passage, because I felt like we should meditate on that, because when I think about Kashmir, when I think about Ladakh as an anthropologist, this is peoples. This isn't, for me, this isn't borders. This isn't lines. And you mentioned that, when Hasina, one of your research partners, she mentions muhabbat, meaning love, and not to glorify, not to go and become nostalgic for a time which never has been, but she does mention this idea of yul, which I don't know personally, but as you mentioned, that it's a village, it's a globe, it's this global community or some sort of a conscience. But on page 61, I just wanted to read this more for myself and kind of also resound this again. But just to kind of think about this and also think about the necropolitics that is prevalent in the region. Because when I see Ladakh, when I see the dynamics, and I see Ladakhi, Muslims who have come and who reside in Kashmir, or the Uyghurs who have fled in 1947 and who reside in Kashmir, and the dynamics between the two communities. So this kind of makes me think about the kind of necropolitical dynamic that exists in the region and the military occupation. So this really made me think, and I just wanted to read it just to kind of like draw attention to a really empathetic heart in this book, and the kind of futures that we can look towards as you kind of mull over this and say that in a few generations, then Ladakh is a place, and you're talking about what happens when there are these communal rifts happening. Ladakh is a place moved from being a collection of villages in relation to and under dominion by small kingdoms, and tied to a cosmopolitan world of Central Asia through trade routes, and then through the foundational rupture of partition. I don't agree really with the word partition, but it's used very widely, into a mapped and bounded place with an electoral system that promises representation and accountability, inescapably links demography to political power. What is the feeling of this transformation? How does it feel to inhabit a body upon land that is becoming territorialized by state processes? This mesh of lines, districts, and contested sovereignties is spiraling out of ways that the idea and materiality of sovereign state touched through the imperial practices that both normalized and undermined sovereignty as a necessary feature of governance. And I think that's the malaise that we are dealing with at the moment in Kashmir, and a byproduct is what has happened to Ladakh. And at the moment, as we are talking, China is contesting, there's an active fighting going on, and some people say that there's news that there is going to be tourists coming to Bangkok Lake. And Kashmiris are saying that, do we need a visa to go to Ladakh? So that's the can of worms that India has opened after August 9, 2019, August 5th. So, and you end with the subcontinent is enmeshed and entangled in the history of empire itself, history of empire, but I think the empire is well and alive, and we are dealing with neo-imperial state of India at the moment, and Ladakh is a fallout too. So thank you very much for listening to my comments. I don't know if I took a long time, but that's it for now, till the questions. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm up next. So my name's Catherine, hello. I'm going to give a little bit of a description of the book and then move on to around 4 questions, Sara. So Sara's new book, Intimate Geopolitics, provides a rich ethnographic account of reproduction, marriage, and young people's lives in Ladakh as they are caught up in the territorial biopolitics of India's Jammu and Kashmir state. Sara shows tremendous skill and sensitivity in really carefully piecing together the intimate stories of her interviewees, the in-depth historical context so central to their experiences, and the shifting geopolitical situation, and indeed embrace of modernity which continues to shape them and which they themselves shape. Her own positionality, her journey into marriage and motherhood, and its influence on her research and her field engagements, even what is the field, was honoured in the book and detailed in really fascinating detail that I really enjoyed. And for me, Sara's book shows the very best of feminist geography research. So congrats on a really wonderful book. I really loved it. So I have 4 comments and some linked questions for Sara. First up really is the weave. One of the weaves that I loved most about the book was the clandestine and the secret. And I found this particularly intriguing. So we learn at the start of the book, for example, about Fatima and, is it Piljor, their secret courtship, and others like these later on. We hear in chapter 3 about elite Buddhist men's close relationships with Muslims in private. And in chapter 4, the breakdown of close familial Buddhist-Muslim relationships and the clandestine telephone conversations that ensue are explored. And I think the ethnographic research really beautifully reveals the complexities of intimate life lived in a Ladakhi context. It explores intimacies which could be obscured or hidden from view in some way. And I was wondering if you could reflect a bit more on the spatial politics of the clandestine and the secret, and how this weave in your book might relate to wider power, direct or indirect, relied upon by religions or states or the confluence in pushing people, everyday practices and intimacy into the shadows. The second area that I wanted to touch on was the theme of intermarriages and some of the failures of these that you explain and highlight through participants' eyes. So as you so rightly explain, marriage is a geopolitical tool, and intermarriages in some sense you describe as a form of counter-geopolitics. So I wanted to know, partly because this is one of my niche interests, more about the recording of marriage and divorces in Ladakh, so the administrative kind of bureaucratic dimensions of this. How does it work, and what political effects does that kind of that data have? You describe, I quote, the body's territorial capacity to take up space, reproduce and be counted in elections and censuses. And it'd be great to hear a bit more about this kind of registration process and how maybe these statistics are used for political ends. So for example, breakdown of intermarriages, even though there's few of them perhaps, are they being wielded politically as a means to discourage them and demonstrate a kind of impossibility of intermarriage? Third, I wanted to turn to your complication of Ladakh, seen in many ways as an isolated place, and the way that you tell stories beyond Ladakh, which have connections to them, so the wider kind of geopolitical resonances. And you do this in part through related discussions of what's happening in the United States around contraception and family planning. And you really brought home in many points in the book very messy distinctions between agency and force in contraception decision-making by different women that you encountered. So I found it was a kind of continuity with your journal articles in terms of one of the significant contributions that the book and the journal articles make is thinking geopolitically about reproduction and potentially about the violences of its denial. So last week, and obviously knew this before, I was reading a news article about the forced sterilizations of young Muslims in China and efforts to suppress Muslim minority birth rates. And as you so poignantly state, people's lives, and especially women's lives, are territorial. And there is a biopolitics and even necropolitics of intimate life at work in the way that the book describes it. And I hope you might be able to talk a little bit more about how your research and that links to kind of the wider geopolitical processes and governance of birth that we are seeing at the moment. And then fourth, again, perhaps from a personal perspective, I'd like to know more, is about your experiences of writing the book, the lessons that you've learned. What advice, top tips do you have for anyone about to start writing a monograph? And there were two specific questions that I had. One which was around the way that there were significant political changes on the ground as you wrote the book. And one of the things that I've struggled with personally is that the longer the book I wrote took, many years, the greater number of political changes were happening on the ground, and the greater need to go back to participants, and the greater need to kind of think, is this kind of accurate? Is this analytically correct? Does this honour the voices of those people that I've met? So the way I describe the experience is a bit like a rolling stone that kind of gathers moss, and it becomes all the more impossible to handle. I would really love to know how you handled that, because I do think you handled it very well. So more insight into that process would be handy, and I think a lot of people in that I know of have this challenge. The second question was about how you decided which interviewees to focus on and return to in the book. So I thought it worked incredibly well, the way that you kind of wove some of their lives through their book, and I'd love to know a bit more insight into how you made that decision making on the structure and the weave. In sum, thank you for a really inspiring book, and yeah, congrats again.
Okay, I think that's me. I'm Majid Akhtar from King's College London. Thank you for having me on this panel. I've been looking up to Sara and learning from Sara for a long time now, since the first year of grad, as one of the few South Asian geographers who was also in the department with me. So it's very a privilege to comment on this book. So I'm just going to read to keep myself on time. So bear with me if it gets too monotonous. When I was 15, I got on a plane and left my home and family to go to school in another country. I did it again when I was 18 and again when I was 22. And one more time several years later. Along the way, my idea of nationhood, or what it means to be a part of the nation and the world, changed. Speaking right now to a virtual room with many fellow academics, I imagine I am not alone in this journey across borders to attend school, earn degrees, and pursue desirable futures. Like the families and young people from Ladakh in Sara's rich and elegant monograph, these educational decisions reflected not only my own anxieties and hopes regarding an uncertain but potentially promising future, but also accounted for the feelings and predictions of imagined real futures and the role that schooling realizing these visions are a fitting site of analysis in this book that are a bit hidden and that I'd like to kind of tease out a little bit more in my response. My fellow panelists have already covered some of the more central aspects of marriage, and generational cultures are constitutive of geopolitical processes of territory making, bordering, and regionalization. The book understands territorialization as a bodily practice and unsettles orthodox scalar assumptions about the geopolitical. Instead of looking at the interstate or diplomatic domain narrowly as geopolitics, the book focuses our attention on the sphere of the emotional, the rhythms of the everyday, the scales of the body and the neighborhood, and on the threshold of the home. Here I want to offer some more kind of narrowly focused thoughts on schooling as a theme, as it brings together identity, generational difference, youth, migration, identity, and the idea of territorial futures. Sara reports a conversation with a political functionary in which the functionary disparages women who he proclaims have, quote, grown too proud to send their children to government schools, end quote, and thus are wasting precious community resources. Sara is quick to rebut this and remarks that the families she has spoken with were, quote, not acting out of pride or vanity, but out of intention and hope that their children have happy, safe lives free from back-breaking or degrading physical labor. This tension around the question of private schools, which is intimately tied to the imagined futures of children and of the nation, hints at a broader political relationship in which the state cannot be trusted to care about children's futures. Such a lack of trust is perhaps widespread in the broader region. The boom in private education over the past 2 decades in Pakistan that I have seen can certainly be read as a lack of confidence in state-provided education. Perhaps this tension forms a major unacknowledged fault line of geographical difference in how families in different world regions engage the institutionalized sphere of social reproduction that is schooling. For example, a 2019 report from The Economist on private education reported that in China, households now spend 5% of income on education, and in India, it's 4%, compared with only 2.5% in the US and only 1% for European. So double, maybe even triple the amount of money is going towards securing private education to secure future territories. So what is the political and cultural meaning of disassociating the future from a government-run education system? And what does this do to territorialization and national identity? This is hinted at in the book, but I think it could be pulled out a bit more. Schooling also becomes important in the last 2 chapters of the book, where we hear more from young people themselves. School is not only a space of institutionalized education, it is a site of cultural negotiation and contest, of navigating complex identities, of encountering official geopolitical narratives, and it is also a major pathway to fulfilling economic aspirations. School offers contradictory messages for the future as well. As Sara argues, quote, for some it is a sign of modernity and a beacon for a peaceful future. For others, education has been sowing the seeds of division. Of course, many see it through both lenses simultaneously. Paul Willis, in his classic Learning to Labor, argues that schools can serve as a site for young people to sort out and solidify their social, gender, and class identity with respect to national futures. And we see this very clearly in Intimate Geopolitics. In chapter 6, Generational Vertigo and the Future of Territory, Sara discusses the spatiality of Ladakhi identity in the context of youth migration to cities in Kashmir, in lowland India, or abroad for schooling. One student told Sara about how they identified as Indian, not when they were living in the national capital of Delhi, where Ladakhis are often grouped together as borderland minorities, but only once they left India to study in the US. How Ladakhi territorial space and identity articulates and overlaps with other regional identities is thus a story of connection, movement, and change that articulates the international with the body through the figure of the student migrant, who is ethno-racialized in different ways at different border crossings, which are both within and outside what we call the state, the nation state. So gesturing towards internal borderlands and peripheries as well, I think is really important. So understanding how universities shape national identity and the discourse around territorial futures is very important, not only with respect to Ladakh and India, but in the South Asian context much more broadly. The discrimination and securitization faced by Pashtun, Baloch, and other university students from internal borderlands and peripheries, including Gilgit-Baltistan, by the way, which is part of the larger contested area, is a highly political question and very, very alive one today in Pakistan as well. So there are affinities across the borders in the different national contexts with respect to universities and internal kind of borderlands. And of course, schooling is a terrain of politics and identity formation that goes well beyond South Asia. Sarah briefly reflects on this in the conclusion of the book when she's discussing the politics of race, class, and school districting in North Carolina. The geopolitics of schooling as a site of institutionalized but contested social reproduction can show schools as the testing ground and terrain for various territorial futures. This was a present and powerful but somewhat hidden theme in the book that for me connected themes of sovereignty, territorial futures, and youth, and speaks to, I think, a broader feminist geopolitical research agenda on schooling, society, and territorialization, and ethnicity and race as well, and kind of how you learn to be these different identities in the context of school. So I want to end by emphasizing how the book very compellingly portrays geographies connected to territory, borderlands, religious difference, frontier regions, peripheries, region, family, kin, partition, diaspora. So these social spatial categories are seemingly very place neutral and abstract, but in Sarah's book, they come to life and allow us to understand territory as a thoroughly concrete, social, embodied, and lived social relationship. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
All right. I want to start by just saying thank you for such really generous and expansive readings of the book. I'm really humbled by that. And I don't think I can do justice to your comments, but I'll just say some things. I guess in order. First, Akhtar, it was so nice to hear your reflections because it's strange to be so embedded in one context where folks talk about things so differently from how I know they're often talked about just a few hundred miles away. So it was interesting to hear your comments, especially on this topic of like lists of names that get released about jobs that have been given and who have the jobs been given to. And the way that those positions or those postings are both like a burden on the person who's being posted and this inclusion into this state that you don't want to be included in the first place, even while they're read as acts of exclusion by Ladakhis, especially Ladakhi Buddhists. So seeing that those two sides really reminded me of August 2019, when it was this strange moment when I was looking at social media and seeing all this fear and terror for what is happening to Kashmiris in the lockdown. And then in the Ladakh in the media pages, there's celebrations, there's people took over the street. And it was just so heartbreaking to see the way that people have been set up. As you said, there have been these rifts have been really created and then further deepened in the post-colonial era, such that one person's celebration of autonomy is totally contingent on other people's cut off into darkness. It was just this heartbreaking moment, and the way you were talking about how such a list of names could be read so differently depending on your positioning was really helpful. I'm grateful for that insight. And I think that speaks more to this question of the way that democracy, especially when it's actually functioning as governance and not really engaged in folks' genuine autonomy, the way that it then does create this positioning of folks in relation to minority status. So you can only ever be claiming your rights as a minority of one kind or another. And often I would move through these different spaces where Shia Muslims are telling me, like, we're the most minority, here, and Buddhists are telling me we're going to die out. So it's this way that you're moving through these spaces and your rights can only be claimed as this position of some kind of a minority status in ways that then makes it so hard to generate solidarities of any kind. So I was really grateful for your insights around that and the phrasing, or just sort of seeing the other side, because I often have this anxiety that because I go out in the community, and then I'm always coming home to like a Buddhist household where we're like in the kitchen and talking about things in a certain way. So it's like, I feel that I get deeper and deeper into that mindset, and it's harder to understand other perspectives. Yeah, so that was really a gracious and helpful reading. And Catherine, it's funny that I hadn't thought about how this book is all about secrets. I don't know why, that I was sort of struck by that when you said that, because that's very, yeah, of course it is, but then somehow I hadn't really put that together. I mean, I had thought a lot about the difference between marriage and family planning, because I was really struck in the research about the ways that, as Akhtar said, people love family planning. Family planning is really popular. It's pretty handy. So everybody loves to keep that family size small. And nobody really knows what you're doing. Maybe you just couldn't have another kid, or maybe you got your tubes tied. That's a secret. So it's so different the way that that hinges instead of marriage, where the whole intent of marriage is to make it public. So I feel like that distinction between what is public and private like really hinges on how these different things play out, because it never ceased to surprise me the way that this kind of campaign to end intermarriage has been so successful. And that kind of ties to your next question, because why was it? I remember in my dissertation research way back in the day thinking, why was it that, you know, everybody is still using family planning, but then it's really, it's basically impossible to marry somebody of the other religion. So that ties to your other question, which is that intermarriages don't get registered in Ladakh. Like folks won't go to the courthouse there. So they just know that if you go there, nobody's going to sign your papers. So you have to go over the mountains. So sometimes people would talk about that as like a seasonal thing, because it's so much easier to get out in the summer. So folks will go to Jammu, or they'll go to Delhi. They'll go to somewhere where their names won't register the same way, and get married there, and then stay there or come back. And then it's when you come back that there's trouble. So that is even the case of this woman I write about in the end, who wrote like an op-ed about her marriage, saying, yes, I am a Buddhist who married a Muslim, and no, you can't call me as a property. And she has also like traveled outside to marry and then come back. Yeah. So let's see. So I think one of the ways in thinking, I struggled with one of the points that you make. So this question of how do I stay true to the lives of the folks who I'm talking with? Like at once when folks are talking to me, I feel that I see this everywhere, some of the things that we're talking about. Like we have had, I mean, the United States was like founded in eugenics and genocide. So there has always been this population politics undergirding everything. So it's at once like really resonant, but then I get anxious about evacuating like the specificity and the importance of context and what this story means to the person who's telling it to me. So I get a lot of anxiety about how to move between contexts like that. But I did see especially these resonances with what I've been calling with other folks demographic fever dreams, like the way these absurd fantasies seemingly take on power the more absurd they are, like the love jihad idea that, you know, Muslim men are out there, you know, just seducing women right and left in order to like create these Muslim babies. Like it's really, it's a little bit far-fetched, right? So then it's almost that sometimes the more of the kind of strangeness of these fantasies somehow makes them take on a different kind of power somehow. So I've been trying to think about the ways that that works, that kind of logic. We see it playing out in India with Hindu nationalism, and then we see it here with white supremacy, and the way that kind of a dystopian vision is used to try to rile up white people to vote for right-wing nationalists. So I do see a really continuity in the ways that those politics play out, and the way that the fear of an unknown future kind of drives this fear-based politics that always lands on the bodies of those who are most vulnerable. And that's why in the book, I also write just a little bit about the family separation policy in the US and the ways that fictive white kinship comes to be this driving force in politics, such that folks, families of especially brown immigrants are, forcibly separated and sort of disallowed from having kin relations, while this fictive white family is like strengthened through fear, a kind of geopolitics of fear. Let me see how I'm doing for time. So I was trying to think about that future thinking and what it enables across context, but trying not to give up the details of the lives of the people who shared their stories with me. So I find that difficult. When it comes to writing, I mean, writing is so hard. I don't know what to say about that. Like, my secret to writing is I have to do it first thing in the morning before all the affective labor lands on me, like my child's math homework, whatever drama is in our faculty meeting. Like, I can't, after all that stuff happens, I can't think straight. So in terms of the long-termness of that, so I'm that like annoying person who gets up really early in the morning. But in terms of the long-termness of that, I really struggled to write this book. Like, I thought about writing this book in 2011, and then I got pregnant, and I was like, this seems very difficult. And then I kind of only came back to it because Peter Berta came to me and said, oh, would you like to be part of this series? And I was thinking, okay, I wrote half a book. That's really not the way to live. So I came back to it. And then, like you said, it was really a struggle to come back because everything was different. So what happened then was that I could really only think about it by thinking about specific people who would be interested. And actually, I thought about the young people who I talked about more in chapters 5 and 6, because my frustration with the earlier work and the articles even had been that I talked to a lot of women who talked to me because they liked me. And they weren't necessarily interested in my book. They were like, hey, sweetie, like, sure, if it helps you, I'll talk to you. Like, it's like, I'm like an amusement. It's like, oh, this random white woman speaking Ladakhi, like, that's a fun way to spend an hour. But then they don't care so much about the analysis part. So the fun thing about working with college kids is I could send them chapters and be like, hey, what do you think? And so that really sort of helped me to try to think about how could I communicate across these different generations and what would folks have to say about it? And then just thinking about like these specific few moments that in terms of the selecting stories, I think like I tried to think about like, when did I know a thing? What was the moment when I learned something? And then just to start from one or two of those in each chapter. But I still have a lot of anxiety about the whole thing. I think I just have like 2 minutes left. So with Majid, yeah, I think a lot about education. I mean, we're also embedded in these universities that are doing such strange things with students and faculty and all of us really, that are such political sites and then try to read as not such. So I think about that a lot in terms of the way that our universities try to like package cosmopolitanism or package global citizenship and sell it to the students, when they've always been about a kind of global citizenship that's imperial and unequal, such that like our campus was built by people who were enslaved. It's always been global. It's never not been global. But then they're trying to sort of sell that global vision to a new generation of like first generation college students who are entering education as this site of cosmopolitanism as forward looking. And that's those are ideas that I've also written about with Mike Dimple. That is something I think about a lot as what kind of citizen is the university trying to make and to what end? And I see that here as well as in Ladakh, where folks are experiencing like love and freedom and like just like lack of supervision and really having a lovely time at university. Just as they're experiencing, like, this is a place where I'm supposed to connect to the nation state, and the nation state is telling me that it does not want me. So, like, as I am. So I feel that a lot. I think I took up my time, though I don't know that I did justice to the questions. Thank you all so much for your generous readings. It's really expansive and kind of you.
Thank you, everyone. I have a quick correction to offer. I think I introduced Akhtar with a kind of old bio, unfortunately. She's actually associate professor at the University of Northern Colorado, and her book, Resisting Disappearance, came out last year with the University of Washington Press. So I wondered if anyone in the audience had any questions. I think we have just one question from someone who says, what can you do for disability? I'm not sure what that means. And if that's a question about, I don't know how the book might address disability, but I wondered if there are any other questions from the audience, please put that into the Q&A. And in the meantime, did any of the panelists want to respond or speak back to Sara's responses in any way?
So I just wanted to comment on the depth of each of the comments that was made here that made me go in different directions, including Majid's, Catherine's, and Sarah's. You know, Majid, when you mentioned the public school education, especially in Kashmir region, I echo what Sarah has illustrated in her book, that public school education is not seen as a worthwhile, credible education that you can give your kids, and you do everything in your power to give them a private school education. And then what kind of citizens are we creating, or what kind of people are we engineering in the process? What kind of futures are we fashioning out of these young students? In Kashmir, like from a Kashmiri vantage, the kind of schooling that happens there, it's in service of the state, and not the Kashmiri state. It's in service of the Indian state and the impositions that have been happening. My generation never knew reading Kashmiri, or we spoke Kashmiri, but we didn't read Kashmiri, we didn't write Kashmiri because it was looked down upon. But I think most of these things, when we look at them, there are two ways to look at them. One is the post-colonial aftermath. I think that has happened to the entire subcontinent, where English has kind of gained the preeminence, and the rest of everything has fallen into the stepmotherly kind of mode. People who don't speak English, they don't seem to be intelligent, even if they're speaking the right things in their vernacular language, which is why the private schools, like if you look at the difference between the private school curriculum and the local school curriculum, the government school curriculum, the difference usually is English instruction. When do you start instructing kids in English? So usually the government schools, they would start instruction in English at 6th grade. Till then, they were doing the Kashmiri and Urdu combination. And I'm sure in Ladakh, they were doing the Ladakhi and Kashmiri Urdu combination, or maybe Hindi. So it was seen as a great disadvantage for the kids because they couldn't catch up right after that. Despite the fact that most of the faculty in the government schools, because it's the government that recruits you through these really stringent processes, of course it's corruption ridden, but you would at least be a master's degree holder to teach in a government school. In a private school, you can still be in 12th grade or still getting your bachelor's degree, and you can just have a job, because private schools are also known to pay the teachers very less than the government schools. So there's this strange, ironic, contrasting threads running through, where you have like best trained faculty in government schools, but they're ridden by bureaucracy so much that those teachers don't teach at all, which is also the reason why people don't send kids to these schools. So there's like several ways to look at it. One is kind of like looking at it from thinking about that this is from a Kashmiri vantage, not the Ladakhi vantage, but of course they're interrelated. That these are, and also who is the faculty in Ladakhi schools in Ladakh region? Where do these teachers come from? Because many of them do come from the Kashmir Valley and other parts. What is the curriculum like? And it is in the service of Indian nation state, so to speak. And then do the private schools have some different kind of autonomy? They don't. And now what we see after it has been converted into union territory, we see there is some kind of like uniform curriculum happening. Kashmiri has been introduced like 5-6 years back. But again, the kind of citizens that this kind of education in that region they are trying to manufacture is just in service of Indian nation state. There is no connection with Kashmiri history. There is no connection with Kashmiri language. And after the Union territory was, it was converted, militarily re-annexed and converted into a Union territory, what has been done is that the Hindi is being imposed, and now people are fighting against that. So I don't know what's happening in Ladakh at the moment, because Hindi is being blanket imposed. And now Ladakhis are actually trying to, because they're a separate Union territory, now they're suddenly realizing, oh no, this is a different design. And I think there is a dichotomy there, because the people from Kargil that I've spoken to, not a lot of people, but my friends from Kargil, it seems like Muslims already had an idea of what kind of demographic terrorism India is playing out in this region. And it also seems that the Buddhist Ladakhis have an inkling, but it's more like frying pan kind of a situation. And also this weaving that has been done, especially after Sindhu Darshan in 1997, when Hindu Rashtra really plays out without the facade. Now you have the sort of like this Hindu-Buddhist syncretism, which is really ironic. Like Buddhists were decimated because Brahmanism took over. And now the syncretism was kind of like propagated, which is pilgrimage tourism fueled by Hindu supremacy. That's how it can be read very easily now, especially. So all of that, the education really is in service of all of that. And that's if you ask me, like, what have you studied? I was in a private school, but then the curriculum was pretty much the same except for English. So that's what we have. We've studied the World War, we've studied Indian independence movement, but nothing about Kashmir. And and then there were several institutions inside Kashmir and Ladakh, Kargil too, which were giving the curriculum that India wants. It was called the NCERT in the 90s. But then it was also giving Islamic education. It was also teaching Urdu. It was also teaching Persian, so that, the Central Asian connection that you mentioned, the cosmopolitan connection that has gone away, replaced by the Delhi connection now, those schools were trying to bring back that kind of an ethos, if not in a big way, but in a small way. And most of them were connected to the Jamaat Islami movement. And mind you, Jamaat Islami in Kashmir was not a political movement and still is not. So then they got into trouble. So that's kind of a little vantage from how I see the education system and what it is in service of at the moment inside Indian administered Kashmir.
Thank you for that, Akhtar. We have two questions that have come up, and I'm just going to read them out quickly. And I think if Sara can perhaps address them, or any of the other panelists, we might actually conclude after that. So we have a question from someone called Arvind Kumar Meel, who says, has evolution of economic monoculture anything to do with this societal stratification? And then Alex Manby, who is my student at Oxford, asks if Sara has any thoughts on how relationships between bodies, territory, and borders play out in queer bodies and in non-heterosexual relationships, and if this might actually relate to Catherine's discussion of the clandestine and the secret. Sara, I think you're muted.
I think I feel like saying something about public school education, but then I'm scared if I start, I won't stop. Yeah, so I mean, it sort of ties into the other ones too. I mean, I think it's related to this economic monoculture, just the pressure that folks feel to integrate into the cash economy and to try to understand what that means, particularly if you are a farmer who didn't go to school and you know that your kid needs to get this thing called education, but what that's like or what it means or which kind is sort of like a black box to you, especially folks from the smaller villages. There's a big difference from those who are already like they're in a government job and their kid is going to school. But I think that public school education, there's so much pressure to send your kids to the private school. It's really bearable. Like folks will be breaking rocks on the roadside, they will be selling the milk from the cow, and doing every manner of thing to really manage to send their kids to private school, such that, you know, my mother-in-law is a school teacher, and most of the folks in the public schools where she taught, they are folks who have some kind of learning disability, or they are folks who are the children of Nepali or other migrant workers. It's very rare to have most families send their kids to the public schools at this point, just because of that economic pressure. And this economic pressure and the societal stratification question, that's just one of the ways that folks also put these in terms to me. Like now folks tell me, because of this pressure to go into the economy in a certain way, because of this pressure to get an education, that's why we have to be kind of in our religious segregation in some way. Like they explain animosity between different religions as a natural outcome of education, which when I first encountered it, because I've grown up in this, like, you know, neoliberal, whatever, illusion of democracy or whatever, it's really hard if somebody tells you like education is causing the problems. It's like the opposite of what I was taught to believe. But a lot of folks feel that that is the case, and they will say like, we didn't used to, you know, fight like this when we didn't have this economic structure. We didn't used to fight like this before we were literate, which was especially one that really struck me. Folks telling me back in the day, like we didn't understand our own religious texts, or we didn't understand the context of modern democracy, and we didn't have to fight because in some ways we were just all here together. So I feel like that definitely plays a role. And I love the second question. I really had anxiety about that question, honestly, because it's such, my book is so heteronormative that it would stress me out. Like this whole, it's like you have marriage, then you have babies, and then you have send your kids to school. Like, where is queer life in this story? So I remember like coming up with the survey question and asking, like kind of talking through my questions with folks and having questions like, when do you expect to get married? And then thinking about like, oh, maybe this question should be like, do you want to get married? Like just trying to make little spaces to have different kind of conversations that definitely did come out in different ways. More so with talk around queerness came out more with the college students, who would tell me about these moments when they're watching TV with their parents and there's coverage of like, actually one conversation was about gay marriage in the US, and seeing that their parents had like a different reaction, and they had been to like a, you know, pride parade, and they were thinking, oh, my parent is having this really different reaction, and I don't know how to have this conversation with them. So things would come out around queerness in those kind of ways, or in how people talk about their gender identity. Like just people telling me that they felt like, I think I talk about one woman in the book who tells me, you know, like heteronormative gender roles have never worked for me. Like I don't feel comfortable in them. And then I don't know how to explain this to my parents, or how to talk through these things in this context. So they definitely come out, but at the same time, I feel like the structure of the book, which is being around gender and power relations, it is kind of overarchingly heteronormative in a way that also gives me anxiety. So I appreciate that question.
Oh, I was muted. Okay, I think that might bring us to the end. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for having taken the time to read the book and engage with it so thoroughly. I think this was an absolutely enlightening discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, and thank you most of all to Sara for having written this book, which you know, has raised so many interesting questions, I think, for everyone. And thank you to everyone who attended this session, which I know was a little bit late in the UK, and you know, for having attended from all of these many time zones. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night. Have a good rest of the day, Sara.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much, Sneha.
No, thank you. All right, bye.
Bye.